In this video, we're going to be jumping into S3, which is a serverless system called Simple Storage Service. It's basically an unlimited hard drive. You can store anything you want in it, big video files, medium, image files, or even tiny text files. It can be used to drive events, it can be used to drive workflows. It's a very, very powerful tool. We'll be getting into it and running into a few problems along the way. We'll have to set up IAM to make sure that we have access to it. Let's go ahead and jump in, but before we do, please note that these videos are going to be two of our longer videos. We're going to be introducing a lot of new concepts, so make sure you have a glass of water and maybe a snack to get through them. Let's go ahead and get started. Before we jump in, I want to talk a little bit about what we'll be doing in this video. First, we're going to be creating a brand new function. Then we'll log the incoming information that we get that is going to be sent from the invoking agent. And this could be a number of different invoking agents. In the last video, we saw that this could be the CLI, or it could be another Lambda function. There are many possibilities. Then we're going to create a unique file name, and that file name is going to be used to store the parameter that was sent up to us. Then we're going to create a unique file name. We're going to store the string that was sent up to us in the input parameters, and then we're going to log a response that we're going to send to the invoking agent. In that response, we'll store the name of the file that we created. The concepts that we're going to learn in this video will be working with incoming variables, creating a UUID, which is a universally unique identifier, writing to an S3 bucket, handling errors, and finding out other things along the way. Additionally, we'll take a brief look at promises and asynchronous functions in Node.js and how they affect our environment in Lambda. This will be different than our first project in a number of different ways. First, we're actually going to have some logic going on here where we take input information. This is going to be different than our first project. In a number of ways, this isn't going to be anything like that. We are going to send a response and we are going to do some logging, but everything else is pretty much different. The first thing we're going to do is interrogate the incoming variables, log them, and use them to create an S3 object. To do this, we're going to need the AWS SDK library for Node.js. We'll take a look at that, and then we'll be using this to build our other services. This will be the first time that we've used another service, and as such, we'll need the libraries for it. Okay, now that we know what we're going to do, let's go ahead and jump into our AWS Management Console as per usual, and we're going to go over to Lambda, and here we'll go ahead and create a new function. Let's go ahead again, author from scratch, and the function name will be S3POC. I often use POC for proof of concept. This is a nice way to signify which classes are meant to be used in the long term and which ones are actually proof of concepts. Let's go ahead and create our function. And now that we're in here, we'll find that we were in a very common spot as we were before. Everything else should look about the same. It's automatically created our role for us. We have all of our default settings, 3 seconds for our timeout and 128 megs for our RAM. Everything is just the same as it always is. So let's go ahead and get in here and do some coding. Let's go ahead and start by toggling this to full screen and removing this default template code. It's useful to type all of your code by hand the first time. This is useful because it'll help your brain start wrapping around the concepts and get your hands used to doing this type of coding. You'd be surprised at the difference it makes when you're typing the code for the first time and when you copy and paste it. Let's take this one step at a time. First, let's go ahead and log out the information that we've got. Now, we can actually go ahead and just run this. So let's go ahead and save it and click test for the first time. Every time you click test for the first time, you're going to see this screen. In this case, we're actually going to be using the input values. So let's go ahead and take the time to write a JSON packet that we want to receive that makes sense for us. We want to take in a string that's a sentence and save it into an S3 bucket object. So our JSON parameter object can actually be very simple. Let's go ahead and say sentence. Hello there. My name is Greg and I like sushi. Perfect. Now let's go ahead and click create. Oops, forgot the name. Greg sushi test. And now if I click save and click test on Greg's sushi test, I should see that this information got logged and there's our sentence, and we didn't do anything with it, so this is pretty basic. Notice that our response is also null. Okay, next up we're going to add in the AWS SDK with a require statement. The AWS SDK is automatically provided to us by Lambda as sort of a first-class citizen, as well as some other libraries that are very common and useful, such as the ability to create a UUID, which stands for Universally Unique Identifier. And those are useful because basically you can create a string that is guaranteed to be globally unique and only in your system. This is very useful when you want to create things that are going to be stored long-term in your system, and you're going to be creating a lot of them, and you don't necessarily have a unique name for them right off the get-go. So let's go ahead and start by importing the AWS SDK, declaring our S3 object, and getting access to the UUID library. We don't need to configure any security for our code. The SDK is automatically set up by the role that we have assigned to this Lambda function. This is why those roles are so important. Now that we have access to the objects we need, let's go ahead and go down into our function body and create a new UUID that will act as our file name. Once we've created the new UUID, let's log it out to our log file so that we know when we're testing this what our file name should be. Last, let's go ahead and put our sentence into the S3 bucket. I'm going to go ahead and paste in the link to the documentation. This is a habit I've gotten into so that if I need a quick reference, I can just go ahead and copy and paste this into a browser tab. Okay, that calls the method, but this isn't a very good way to work within Lambda. If we were to run this, in fact, let's look at what happens when we do run this. Let's go ahead and click Save, and go ahead and click Test. And you'll notice that we have an error here. It's unable to stringify the response body to a JSON. So this essentially means that the object that we returned was basically nonsense to Lambda. Lambda expects one of a few things back. You can easily return a JSON object to represent the response of your function. However, a more useful thing to do is to return a promise and have all of its functionality built into the then and catch statement. Lambda will automatically recognize when you return a promise from these functions and will continue executing the promise until it gets a response to the then or the catch portion of our promise. This is a good example of what I mean by running code and getting errors that you want to respond to. This isn't something we're going to code around because this isn't something that we want to leave as an error inside of our code. So we'll fix this one. So let's go ahead and get to doing that. The way we're going to fix this is by turning this into a full-blown promise with a then and a catch statement. And then we'll go ahead and run it again. Okay, let's take a quick little break to take a look at this little tiny eye right here. This is an informational message, and they'll appear over here when you've made either a minor mistake or it wants to make a suggestion on a cleanup. For instance, if you don't use a variable, you'll get one. In this case, I've forgotten to put a semicolon here, so I'm going to go ahead and correct that immediately. I like to keep this clean. However, informations can be safely ignored. Now that we've finished coding on this function, let's see if we actually got it right and give her a save and a test. Wow, that's a lot of log output. Let's take a look at it one little step at a time. So first up here at the top is our response. This is what was returned from one of these two return statements. In this case, success is false. So we know that it got to the catch statement. The message is there was a problem saving, and the message from the error object was access denied. And the object name in this case is none, clearly because we didn't get to save it. So we wouldn't want to represent anything otherwise. Let's take a look at why our access was denied. If we scroll down, we'll see that we have a little more information. So it got into our class because this is the first line of code up here. And there's our sentence. The file name for our sentence will be, so it picked a UUID, but it could not save. Here's that access denied. And because we used console.error, we have a much better stack trace and ability to go find where our error occurred at. So in this particular case, we know that the error happens to have occurred as the only call remaining in our method. So s3.putObject has returned access denied. And we know that because it also logs out that we could not save the object to S3. And again, because we have this error object provided here, we get this additional logging. So we've run into our first error. And this is common. When you're programming, you are going to run into things that you don't expect. This is the first one, and I wanted to put it here so that we would have a chance to solve a problem in a real-world set of circumstances. In this case, the role that Lambda created for us in IAM doesn't have the permissions to access S3. or more specifically, put an object into our bucket, Eduonix, Hello World, S3, Greg Harrington column. This access denied error is relatively easy to fix by going into IAM and giving our role permissions to access this S3 bucket, and specifically the put object method. However, we're going to save that to the next video. But before we move on, I want to take a look at this last line of code here, or log output rather. The duration of our method was 1667 milliseconds, and that is underneath our timeout. So I'd like to produce a slightly different error so that we can see that our catch statement is providing us with valuable information. So if I untoggle the full screen and come down here and set our timeout to just 1 second and click save and click test, I can scroll back up here and find that I got an entirely different error. So it got these same first 2 lines, but notice that the task timed out after 1 second. So we get an error message directly from Lambda because it has stopped our code from running and responded with a message from Lambda directly. So it's important in your code to take these into account if you are going to have timeout considerations in your code. All right, we got into some error handling. We saw how CloudWatch is involved in recording errors, but we're not quite done yet. We don't have our S3 application working the way we need it to. We've run into a couple of errors. We even generated one ourselves. So in the next video, we're just going to continue down this road. Let's go ahead and jump over there now.